Dr. Sarah Vance had 17 minutes to reach the field station before the satellite window closed. Her Subaru clawed through mud on the logging road, headlights cutting tunnels through fog that pressed against the windshield like living tissue. The radio crackled with Pete Larson's voice, tight with something she'd never heard from the veteran park ranger in 8 years of collaboration. "Sarah, you need to see this before we move forward. Before we call anyone else. Just you." She'd been cataloguing snow leopard scat samples in her university lab when the call came. Mundane work, a world away from whatever had put that edge in Pete's voice. The Olympic Wilderness Research Station sat 40 miles from the nearest highway, a cluster of weathered cabins where her team monitored apex predator movements and habitat fragmentation. Black bears, cougars, the occasional wolf dispersing from Canada. Nothing that should sound like the end of the world in Pete's tone. The station's lights appeared through hemlock branches, yellow squares of civilization in 11 million acres of temperate rainforest. Pete stood in the doorway of the medical cabin, backlit and motionless. As Sarah killed the engine, she noticed his rifle leaning against the doorframe, a breach of every protocol they'd established. Pete treated firearms like surgical instruments, necessary, carefully maintained, never casually displayed. "Inside," he said, "glove up first." The medical cabin served as their wildlife treatment facility, a sterile space with examination tables, anesthesia equipment, and a small surgical suite for injured animals awaiting transport to rehabilitation centers. It smelled wrong tonight. Beneath the standard antiseptic overlay, something earthier, almost mineral, like wet stone and decomposing cedar. On the main examination table lay a form covered by a thermal blanket. The shape underneath was too large, proportions subtly wrong. Sarah's mind catalogued possibilities, rejecting each in turn. Black bear, too narrow at the shoulders. Elk, legs bent at impossible angles. Human, far too massive. "Pete, what am I looking at?" He didn't answer, just pulled back the blanket. Sarah's breath stopped. The face was humanoid, but not human. A heavy brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that tracked her movement with obvious focus. The nose was broad and flat, nostrils large and mobile. The jaw protruded slightly, though the teeth visible through parted lips appeared more human than simian, lacking the prominent canines of great apes. Skin was exposed only on the face and palms. The rest of the body was covered in coarse hair, ranging from reddish-brown on the arms to nearly black across the back. The hair itself was unusual, medullated and dense, with an undercoat visible where it had been matted by blood. The blood came from a compound fracture of the right femur, bone fragments visible through torn tissue and matted hair. The leg had been crudely splinted with straight branches and what appeared to be strips of cedar bark, bound with twisted fiber cordage that Sarah's anthropologist brain recognized as hand-manufactured. "Accident site is 2 miles northeast," Pete said, his voice professionally flat, the tone of a man clinging to procedure to avoid confronting impossibility. Logging truck reported an animal darting across the road at dusk. Driver swerved, didn't hit it, but we found blood trail and drag marks. Followed it here. He was trying to reach the river, passed out from blood loss about 50 yards from the tree line. Sarah moved closer, her training overriding shock. The patient, she forced herself to think clinically, was male, approximately 7 feet tall, musculature suggesting immense strength. Chest rose and fell rhythmically. She counted 18 respirations per minute, shallow but steady. She reached for his wrist. The eyes opened fully, fixing on her with unmistakable intelligence. Sarah froze. Those eyes were hazel, flecked with gold, the whites slightly yellowed but clearly visible. The pupillary response was immediate and appropriate to the cabin's lighting. This was not an animal stare, not the blank awareness of even the most intelligent non-human predator she'd studied. This was a person looking at another person, calculating, afraid, determined. "Heart rate was elevated when we brought him in," Pete continued, consulting a notebook with hands that trembled slightly. 115, blood pressure low but stable, 90/60. Temperature is 97.4. We've got him on saline and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Nothing else until you got here. Who else knows? Sarah's voice came out hoarse. Just us and Marco. Pete nodded toward the corner where Dr. Marco Chen, their team's wildlife veterinarian, sat at a stool reviewing X-ray images on a laptop. Marco had treated everything from fractured eagle wings to cougar gunshot wounds without flinching, but tonight his face was the color of old newsprint. Sarah, Marco turned the laptop toward her. Look at this. The femur fracture was clean on the radiograph, clearly recent, but the bone density told a more complex story. Thick cortical bone, pronounced muscle attachments, femoral neck angle suggesting bipedal locomotion as primary mode of movement. The pelvis visible in the second image showed a bowl-shaped structure adapted for upright posture, though broader and more robust than modern human morphology. Now look at the hand. The third image showed a hand that could have been human, except for its proportions. Fingers longer and more robust, thumb opposable but set at a slightly different angle, suggesting powerful grip strength. The carpal bones showed full fusion. This was a mature adult. Check the skull series. Sarah's throat tightened as the images loaded. Sagittal crest clearly visible. Massive temporalis muscle attachments, but the cranial capacity was substantial. Marco had calculated approximately 1,900 cubic centimeters, well above modern human average and far beyond any known great ape. The foramen magnum, where spinal cord met brain, was positioned for upright posture. The facial architecture showed pronounced post-orbital constriction, but the brain case was rounded, more human than simian. We need a blood sample, Sarah heard herself say. Sterile technique, full workup, and someone get me a camera with macro capability. I need to document the wound, the splint construction, everything, before we proceed with treatment. The clinical mindset was a life raft in a sea of impossible implications. Whatever this meant for evolutionary biology, paleontology, anthropology, whatever questions it raised about hidden populations and centuries of folklore, right now she had a patient with a compound fracture and declining vitals in her facility. Pete handed her a sample kit, already prepped, but Sarah, we need to talk about what happens after treatment, if he survives, when he wakes up fully, one problem at a time. Sarah approached the table with the confidence of years in the field. The patient watched her, gaze following the syringe, but made no move to resist. She swabbed the antecubital fossa, the inner elbow, and was startled to find the skin under the hair warm, dry, very much like human integument. The vein was prominent and accessible. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured, knowing the words mattered less than tone. "We're going to help." The needle slid home. Dark blood filled the vacutainer, viscous and healthy. The patient's eyes never left her face, but the breathing remained steady. No panic response, no fight or flight, despite obvious pain and disorientation. As she withdrew the needle and applied pressure, the patient's other hand moved, slowly, deliberately. The massive fingers formed shapes in the air between them. Index finger pointed to himself, then to the door, a sweeping gesture toward the forest beyond. Then the hand moved to his chest, repeated the pointing sequence. Me, out, forest, me. Sarah's heart hammered. "You understand what I'm saying?" The eyes held hers, one slow nod. "We need to fix your leg. The bone is broken. Surgery. Do you understand?" A longer pause, then a gesture she recognized from working with indigenous communities in Alaska, hand flat tilted side to side. "Maybe. Uncertain. If we don't repair the bone, you could die. Infection, blood loss. Do you want us to help?" Another pause. Longer this time. The hand moved again, pointed to her, to Pete, to Marco, then pressed against his own chest, fingers spread. Trust, question, plea. Finally, a single nod. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered. We just got consent. The surgery took 4 hours. Marco performed the reduction while Sarah assisted, their hands moving with practiced coordination despite the surreal nature of their patient. The bone fragments aligned cleanly. Internal fixation with plates and screws would have been ideal, but they worked with what they had. External fixation with pins through the proximal and distal fragments, careful alignment, antibiotics pumped directly into the surgical site. Throughout the procedure, the patient remained conscious under local anesthetic blocks. His pain tolerance was extraordinary, though Sarah noted stress responses, elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, hands gripping the table edges with enough force to crack the composite material. He never cried out, never fought them. The eyes remained focused, watching their every move with that same terrible awareness. At 3:47 a.m., Marco placed the final wrap and stepped back. That's the best we can do without a full orthopedic suite. The bone is aligned, no major vessel damage, antibiotics should handle infection risk. He'll need non-weight-bearing status for 6 weeks minimum, probably 8. Sarah cleaned blood from under her nails, mind racing. 6 weeks. They had a conscious, communicative being from an unknown hominid species. She forced herself to think it, to make it real, in their field station, requiring round-the-clock care and absolute secrecy. The blood samples sat in the small centrifuge, waiting for analysis. The photographs documented everything: the bark splint with its precise fiber bindings, the wound track, the anatomical details that rewrote human evolutionary history with every frame. "We can't tell anyone," she said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Pete set down the surgical instruments with excessive care. "Sarah, this is the most important biological discovery in human history. This is a person." Her voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. "Not a specimen. Not a discovery. A person with family, a community, a way of life that has somehow persisted in secrecy for millennia. And if we reveal him, what happens? Invasive study, habitat destruction, federal seizure, media circus, scientists and curiosity seekers flooding these forests." She looked at their patient, now resting with eyes closed, chest rising and falling with deep, exhausted breaths. "We need to ask what he wants. We need to communicate. And we need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any decisions that can't be undone." Marco pulled off his surgical mask, face haggard. "The blood work will take until morning. I can run basic panels here, but for anything detailed, genetic analysis, protein studies, we'll need to send samples out under false pretenses. Say it's a new primate species from, I don't know, somewhere plausible." Later, Sarah felt the adrenaline finally draining, leaving her hollow and shaking. "Right now, we set up a watch schedule. Someone with him at all times, observation, documentation, but also communication attempts. If he can understand speech, maybe we can develop a functional exchange system." Pete had been silent, staring at the patient with an expression somewhere between wonder and grief. "There are stories," he said quietly. "My grandmother was Kino. She told stories about the forest people, the elder brothers who walked before us. Said they were still here just beyond sight, watching the salmon runs and keeping the balance. I thought they were just stories." "Maybe they were meant to be," Sarah replied. "Maybe that's how they've survived, by becoming myth, by living in the space between belief and evidence." The patient's eyes opened again, fixing on Pete with sudden intensity. One hand lifted, moved through a series of gestures, fluid, deliberate, unlike the simpler motions from before. This was something else. This was language. Pete's breath caught. "He's asking about water, the river, needs to reach the river." He looked at Sarah, eyes wide. That's one of the old signs. From the stories, the gesture for sacred water, the place where... The patient's hand dropped back to the table, eyes closing as exhaustion finally claimed him. But the implication hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. They hadn't just found a relic population of archaic hominids surviving against impossible odds. They'd found people who remembered who maintained culture, language, ceremony, who had watched humanity spread across continents and made the deliberate choice to remain hidden, to persist in the margins, paying whatever cost that secrecy demanded. Sarah looked at the blood samples, the photographs, the X-rays that documented impossibility. Every cell of her scientist's brain screamed to publish, to share, to reshape human understanding of evolution and diversity and what it meant to be sentient on this planet. But the man on the table, she committed fully to that word now, man, person, had trusted them, had nodded consent, had shown them a language that predated written human history. Outside the cabin, the Olympic wilderness pressed close, 11 million acres of old-growth forest and unmapped valleys and morning mists that could swallow armies. Somewhere in that vastness was a community, a people, who had buried their dead and told their stories and survived the arrival of another species that thought it owned the world. "We protect this," Sarah said finally. "Whatever it takes. We protect him, and we protect them. Even if it means no one ever knows what we found here tonight." Pete and Marco looked at each other, then nodded. The hardest decision Sarah had ever made came in the form of silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but the deliberate silence of witnessed truth, held sacred. As dawn light began filtering through the cabin windows, turning the forest outside from black to grey to green, she pulled a chair close to the patient's bedside and began the watch. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Humans and forest person alike, bound by surgical intervention and fragile trust, standing at the threshold of questions neither science nor story had prepared them to answer. The blood work came back at noon on the third day, and Sarah had to sit down before her legs gave out. Marco's voice over the satellite phone was carefully neutral, the tone he used when delivering terminal diagnoses to animal owners. "The karyotype is..." "Sarah, it's 46 chromosomes, human normal. But the second chromosome shows clear evidence of fusion, 2 separate chromosomes joined end to end, exactly like the telomeric sequences that mark where our ancestors' chromosomes merged. Except in his case, there's additional material. The banding patterns don't match any known human population." Sarah closed her eyes, phone pressed against her ear. The medical cabin's generator hummed in the background. Through the window, she could see Pete sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of cedar into a smooth curve, nervous hands needing occupation while their world rearranged itself around undeniable facts. Mitochondrial DNA? That's where it gets stranger. Haplogroup dating suggests divergence from modern human maternal lineages approximately 800,000 years ago, much earlier than Neanderthal or Denisovan splits. But the nuclear genome shows more recent admixture. There are segments that match modern human sequences dated to within the last 50,000 years. Interbreeding. The word hung unspoken between them. Not a separate species in the strict biological sense, but a sister population that had diverged deep in the Pleistocene, then occasionally exchanged genetic material with expanding Homo sapiens. Separate enough to develop distinct morphology and culture, close enough that the biological barriers remained permeable. Which means, Sarah said slowly, that somewhere in the human genome there are traces of them, like the Neanderthal DNA in Eurasian populations. Possibly, the admixture patterns I'm seeing suggest it went both directions. Sarah, I don't even have words for what this is. We need to sequence the full genome, compare it against modern human populations, ancient DNA databases. No, her voice came out harder than intended. Nothing that creates a data trail. Nothing that could be reconstructed or discovered later. The basic workup is enough. We know what we need to know. He's human enough that our medical care works, different enough that discovery would make him and his people targets. That's the only relevant information. A long silence. "Then, you're asking me to sit on the most important genetic data in the history of paleoanthropology. I'm asking you to honor consent." He didn't agree to become a research subject. He agreed to let us fix his broken leg. Another pause. All right. I'll keep the samples secure and run only what's necessary for medical care. But Sarah, we need to think about the long term. What happens when he's healed enough to leave? Do we just let him walk back into the forest and pretend this never happened? I don't know yet. But that decision isn't ours alone to make. She ended the call and returned to the medical cabin. 3 days of intensive care had stabilized their patient. The fever from surgical trauma had broken, wound healing progressed normally, and the external fixation showed no signs of infection. But the real breakthrough had come from something other than medicine. The patient, she still didn't have a name for him, couldn't impose one without his participation, had remained conscious and alert through most of his recovery. The first day had been observation only, both sides watching, measuring, calculating trust. But on the second morning, Sarah had brought materials, smooth river stones, charcoal from the stove, pale birch bark stripped from fallen trees. She'd laid them on the bedside table and stepped back, waiting. The patient had studied the materials for long minutes, then reached out with one massive hand. The fingers, so powerful they'd cracked the examination table composite during surgery, moved with surprising delicacy. He arranged 3 stones in a line, pointed to himself, then swept his hand toward the door, the gesture he'd made that first night, indicating forest and distance. Then he placed a 4th stone apart from the others, tapped it, and pointed to himself again, separated from the group. Alone. Sarah had nodded, understanding flooding through her. You got separated from your people. The accident. You couldn't make it back. He'd watched her mouth shape the words, then picked up the charcoal. On the birch bark he began to draw. Not random marks, but deliberate pictographs. A forest represented by vertical lines. A river, sinuous and clear. 4-legged shapes that had to be elk or deer. And figures, simplified but unmistakable. Large bipedal forms among the trees, rendered with a few economical strokes that somehow conveyed both presence and absence. There, but not there. His people, shown as part of the forest itself, not separate from it. Then he drew another figure apart from the group, marked it with a circled X, and tapped his own chest. You were tracking the elk, Sarah guessed. Got too close to the road. Had to move fast and got hit by the truck's edge or something else. A nod. The charcoal moved again, this time drawing a circular shape with radiating lines. Sarah recognized it immediately from her work with indigenous Pacific Northwest communities. A sun symbol, but also a marker of time, season, cycle. He tapped it repeatedly, then held up 7 fingers. 7 days? 7 cycles of something? Your people will look for you in 7 days. He tilted his hand in that maybe gesture, then pointed to the river drawing and made a sweeping motion. Downstream, following the water's flow, his people would search along the river, looking for him. Looking for his body, Sarah realized with a chill. After 7 days with no return, they'd assume he was dead. Over the following hours, they'd developed a rough communication system. Part gesture, part pictograph, part Sarah's running verbal interpretation that he clearly understood on some level, even if he couldn't or wouldn't speak. His vocal apparatus was different. She'd noted the descended larynx position similar to humans, but with structural variations that probably affected phoneme production. He could vocalize, low rumbles, huffing sounds, a clicking noise that seemed to indicate affirmation, but human speech appeared difficult or perhaps culturally prohibited. The language that emerged between them was pidgin, but functional. Sarah learned that his community numbered perhaps 40 individuals, down from twice that in his grandfather's time. They moved seasonally through the Olympic wilderness, following game migrations and salmon runs, carefully avoiding human trails and settlements. They cached food, maintained hidden camps, and above all left no traces. The bodies of their dead were moved to secret locations, caves, he indicated with his drawings, where they could decompose without discovery. Always at night, he emphasized with repeated gestures, always under darkness. Because daylight means helicopters, Pete had said. watching one of these exchanges. Hikers, drones now, but night is still yours. The patient, she'd started thinking of him as Tak, the closest English approximation to a clicking, huffing sound he'd made when gesturing to himself, had paused at that, eyes grave. Then he'd drawn something new, a series of human figures with weapons, fire, and the simplified pictographs of his people, scattered, fleeing, history rendered in charcoal strokes. First contact, Sarah had whispered. Humans arrived and you ran. You've been running ever since. Tak had touched the drawing, then deliberately smudged it with his palm, erasing it. His expression was impossible to fully read through the heavy brow ridge and facial structure, but Sarah had learned enough to recognize the emotion beneath: grief, loss, resignation. Now, on the fourth day, Sarah brought new materials: a map of the Olympic Peninsula, laminated and detailed. Tak studied it with obvious interest, one thick finger tracing rivers and ridgelines with the confidence of someone who knew this terrain more intimately than any cartographer. "Can you show me where you were going, where your people might be?" Tak considered this, then shook his head, not refusal, but uncertainty. His finger circled a large area in the remotest section of the peninsula, a roadless wilderness where elevation changes and dense forest made even hiking trails impractical. Somewhere in those 100 square miles, his community sheltered. "If we help you get back, can you reach them on your own?" He studied his splintered leg, flexed the ankle experimentally, winced, then held up 3 fingers, pointed to the sun drawing. 3 more days? 3 weeks? The gesture was ambiguous. Pete leaned in. "The leg won't be stable for 6 weeks minimum, probably 8 before he can put full weight on it. Even then, moving through that terrain." He trailed off, the logistics defeating optimism. Tak watched this exchange, then tapped the map again. Not the wilderness area, but the river system that drained it. He drew a new pictograph, a figure on a fallen log, being carried by water, then added vertical strokes above the log, suggesting a covering, camouflage. "You want us to float you down river," Sarah said slowly. "Hidden cargo. Let the current do the work, while your leg heals enough to travel the last distance." A sharp click of affirmation. "That's actually brilliant," Pete admitted. "The Ho River flows through some of the most inaccessible rainforest on the continent. If we built a concealed raft, launched at night, let it drift down past the usual fishing spots to the upper wilderness. He could beach it in his people's territory, signal them somehow, and they could retrieve him." Assuming," Marco interjected from the doorway, he'd arrived that morning with fresh supplies, "that infection doesn't set in, that the fixation holds during transport, that he doesn't develop a fat embolism or deep vein thrombosis from immobility, that we don't get caught launching an illegal raft containing an undiscovered hominid species into a protected waterway." Sarah looked at Tak, who watched them with that patient, ancient gaze. "Or what's the alternative? Keep him here until he's fully healed. Then what? Drive him to the forest edge and hope he makes it? Report this to authorities and watch him become the most valuable research subject in history? We don't even know if his people will take him back," Marco said quietly. 8 weeks is a long time. If they think he's dead, if they've already performed whatever rites they do, we could be sending him back to exile." Tak must have grasped the essence of this debate, because he took the charcoal again and drew with fierce concentration a cave mouth. Inside, simplified skeletal figures arranged in specific positions. He drew himself entering, placing something. The pictograph was too small to be clear among the skeletons. Then drew himself leaving, returning to the living figures waiting outside. "Ancestor cave," Pete said, voice hushed. "He's saying he needs to bring something to their burial site. That's his right of return. That's how they'll know he's alive." "What does he need to bring?" Sarah asked. Tak pointed to the surgical waste bin, then made a digging gesture. Sarah's stomach dropped as understanding arrived. "You need a piece of yourself. The bone fragments from the surgery." He nodded slowly, gravely. "Jesus," Marco breathed. "That's not metaphorical. That's literal body as witness. He has to bring proof of survival, his own bone, to deposit with the ancestors. That's his passport back to the living. Sarah retrieved the biohazard container where they'd stored surgical waste, found the sealed bag containing bone fragments they'd debrided during the reduction. She held it up, and Tak's expression shifted, still alien in its architecture, but unmistakably relief. Over the next 3 days, they built what Pete called the worst idea I've ever participated in with full commitment. A raft constructed from salvaged lumber and sealed oil drums for flotation, covered with a woven cedar structure that resembled deadfall. Inside, a padded hollow just large enough for Tak to lie prone with his leg elevated. Waterproof bags contained the bone fragments, dried venison from Pete's hunting stores, fire-starting materials, and crude tools. They worked only at night, assembling components in the medical cabin and transporting everything to a launch site 6 miles upriver from the nearest trail access. Tak watched the construction with intense focus, occasionally making corrective gestures, angle the covering differently, reinforce that joint, camouflage here and here. He's done this before, Pete realized on the 5th night. Not rafts, maybe, but concealment, moving through human-occupied territory without being seen. This is survival expertise that goes back millennia. On the 7th night, they performed the transfer. Tak, leg immobilized and carefully wrapped against moisture, was secured inside the raft's hollow with foam padding and shock absorption that would have impressed any emergency medical technician. Sarah triple-checked the external fixation, repacked the wound with antimicrobial gauze, and administered long-acting antibiotic injections. "You'll reach the confluence in 2 days at current flow rate," Pete explained, tracing the route on a waterproof map they'd included. "Beach at the gravel bar here, where the tributary comes in. You'll see 3 lightning-struck cedars on the north bank. That's still 20 miles from where you indicated your people might be, but the terrain's traversable, even with the leg brace." Tak studied the map, then pulled something from a pouch at his waist. Sarah hadn't even noticed it before. Woven grass so fine it blended with his body hair. He removed a smooth stone, white quartz, with natural striations that caught what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. He held it out to Sarah. "I can't take that," she said automatically. "It's yours. It means something." Tak pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it. The stone was warm from his body heat, worn smooth by handling. Then he made a gesture she'd come to recognize, fingers touching his forehead, then extending outward, remembering, carrying forward. "He's thanking you," Pete said roughly, "making you part of the story. That stone's a memory stone, I think, like the story stones from the old traditions. You're in the tale now, Sarah. You're one of the witnesses who chose silence." Sarah felt tears threatening, forced them back. "Get home safe. Heal completely. And please, stay hidden. The world isn't ready. Maybe it never will be." Tak made that clicking affirmation sound, then placed his hand over hers. Massive, powerful, capable of extraordinary gentleness. For a long moment, they stayed that way. 2 representatives of sister lineages that had walked such different paths to this impossible convergence. Then Marco and Pete were launching the raft, guiding it into the main current, watching as the camouflage structure drifted into darkness and fog. Sarah stood on the bank until the last trace vanished, the quartz stone clutched in her fist like a talisman against forgetting. They hiked back to the station in silence. In the medical cabin, Sarah photographed the quartz stone from every angle, documented its weight and dimensions, wrote detailed field notes about its presentation. Evidence without exposure, memory without betrayal. The next morning she sanitized the surgical suite, disposed of all biological samples except 1 blood vial that she sealed and stored in her personal safe, with a label reading only, "Olympic Project. Confidential." The photographs were encrypted and backed up to a drive that would remain locked until... When? Her death? The extinction of Tak's people? Some hypothetical future where humanity had evolved enough ethical maturity to receive such knowledge responsibly? She didn't know. But the decision not to publish, not to reveal, not to claim scientific glory, felt more certain than any research conclusion she'd ever drawn. Pete found her that afternoon, staring at the map where the Hoh River wound through green wilderness. Think he made it? I think if any being on this planet can drift 40 miles down a wild river with a compound fracture and return to a hidden community, it's someone whose people have survived this long on the margins of human expansion. You know we can't ever talk about this. Not to colleagues, not in journals. We have to take this to our graves. Sarah touched the quartz stone, now on a cord around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt. Not to our graves. We carry it forward. We remember. That's the price of witness. You don't get to set the burden down. Outside, the Olympic forest breathed and grew and kept its secrets. Somewhere in that vastness, a people older than agriculture moved through their ancestral territory, burying their dead in darkness, maintaining ceremonies that predated written language, surviving in the spaces between human knowledge and human ignorance. And 3 scientists sat in their field station, bound by oath and observation to protect something more valuable than any discovery. The right of other consciousnesses to remain unknown, mysterious, safe in their chosen invisibility. The silence they kept was not absence but presence, the sound of guardianship, costly and complete. The first sign came 6 weeks later, at the beginning of winter. Sarah had returned to her university position, throwing herself into teaching with the fervor of someone trying to outrun an experience that had fundamentally altered her understanding of biology, anthropology, and her own species' place in the world. The quartz stone never left her body, worn under her clothes like a secret heartbeat. She was grading papers in her campus office when her phone buzzed with a message from Pete. Olympic Station, 8 p.m. tonight. Come alone. Urgent, but not emergency. The drive took 3 hours through November rain that turned the highways into rivers of reflection. Sarah's mind cycled through possibilities, most of them bad. Infection complications leading to Tak's death, discovery by hikers or hunters, federal authorities investigating unusual activity around the field station. But when she arrived, Pete was standing on the porch with an expression she couldn't pass. Not grief, not fear, but something closer to awe. "Someone left something for you," he said simply, and handed her a bundle wrapped in cedar bark, tied with the same twisted fiber cordage she'd seen on Tak's original splint. Inside was a piece of smooth grey slate, perhaps 8 inches across. Pictographs covered both sides, detailed, deliberate, clearly created with time and care. Sarah's hands shook as she carried it inside under better light. The first panel showed the medical cabin, rendered with enough accuracy that she could identify the window placement and door. Stick-figure humans stood inside, one holding what was clearly meant to be a syringe, and on the table, the simplified pictograph of Tak. The second panel showed the raft journey, water, forest, sky above, and the concealed cargo moving downstream. The third showed arrival, Tak on a riverbank, the damaged legs still splintered. And approaching from the trees, 3 other figures, arms extended. Reunion. The fourth panel was the ancestor cave, skeletal figures arranged in precise positions, and Tak placing something among them, the bone fragments, the proof of survival. But it was the 5th panel that made Sarah's breath catch. It showed the medical cabin again, but this time at night, with darkness surrounding it. And around the cabin, protecting it in a loose circle, were figures. 6 of them, barely indicated, present through suggestion rather than detail, standing watch, guarding. "They've been here," Pete said quietly. "His people. They came to see where he was healed, to verify his story. And Sarah, they've been watching the station since. Not threatening, just present. Marco spotted tracks twice, always 50 meters out, never approaching. One morning I found salmon, fresh caught, still cold, left on the porch. I think it's payment, or thanks, or both." Sarah studied the 6th and final panel. 2 hands, one human-sized, one larger, pressed together palm to palm. Above them, that same symbol Tuck had drawn, fingers to forehead extending outward. Memory, witness, covenant. They know we kept the secret, she whispered. They're acknowledging it. There's more. Pete opened his field notebook. I've been documenting the signs. Not for publication, just for understanding, I guess. They're using the territory differently now. I'm seeing scat deposits along trails humans use, like territorial marking, but also warning. Stay on the trails, don't wander into certain zones. And the salmon numbers in the protected streams have increased. They're managing the spawning grounds, Sarah. Active conservation. They've been doing it all along, we just didn't see it. Sarah sat down, slate tablet heavy in her hands. They're forest wardens, guardians. That's what they've become after millennia of hiding, the keepers of what remains wild, the ones who still know how to read the land's health, how to maintain the balance that predates human agriculture. And we almost destroyed that by discovering them, Pete added. Every instinct of science says to reveal, document, study. But revelation would have ended their ability to function in that role, would have ended them effectively, even if it didn't kill them physically. Marco emerged from the back cabin, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I've been reviewing the genetic data we collected. Just looking, not publishing, not even taking notes that could be recovered. Sarah, the admixture patterns suggest contact with human populations as recently as 300 years ago. They haven't been completely isolated. There's been interaction, exchange, carefully controlled, Sarah said, thinking of the pictographs, the precision of Tuck's communication. On their terms, probably with indigenous communities who understood the protocol, who knew how to interact without exposing them. The stories Pete's grandmother told, those weren't myths. They were disguised instruction manuals, how to coexist with the elder brothers without destroying them. Pete nodded slowly. The Kinol had rules. Don't speak of what you see in the deep forest. Don't follow the voices. Don't disturb the old places. We thought they were about respect for nature in the abstract, but they were literal operational security. And when European colonization arrived, Marco continued the thought, when the model shifted from coexistence to extraction, they had to vanish completely. No more managed contact, no more exchange, total concealment, which is killing them. Sarah's voice cracked. Tuck showed us. His community is down to 40 individuals from 80 a generation ago. That's below minimum viable population for genetic diversity. They're caught between extinction through discovery and extinction through isolation. Silence settled over the cabin like snow. Outside, the Olympic wilderness pressed close, holding its secrets and its dying. So what do we do? Marco finally asked. We can't just watch them fade, but we can't reveal them either. There's no ethical path that doesn't lead to loss. Sarah looked at the slate tablet, at the pictograph of hands pressed together. We honor the covenant. We become their advocates without ever speaking their existence. We fight for habitat protection, against logging expansion, against recreational intrusion into roadless areas. We do the science of conservation without ever naming what we're conserving. That's not enough, Pete said flatly. Not long term. They need range, genetic diversity, resources. Everything that requires space humanity is consuming. I know. Sarah traced the pictographs with one finger, feeling the carved lines like prophecy or warning. But it's what we have, the only tool that doesn't destroy what it's trying to save. We become guardians of the guardians. Over the following months, they developed what Sarah privately called the Shadow Protocol. She redirected her research focus to apex predator conservation in the Olympic Peninsula, arguing for expanded roadless protections and restrictions on recreational access. Pete leveraged his position with the Park Service to implement new trail regulations, closing certain areas during winter for wildlife protection. Marco published papers on disease transmission between domestic and wild animals, making the case for buffer zones around wilderness areas. None of them mentioned Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or forest giants. They spoke only of wolves, cougars, bears, charismatic megafauna that captured public imagination and policy attention. But every hectare they protected, every trail they closed, every regulation they strengthened, created a little more space for the unseen people to persist. The signs continued. Salmon on the porch after particularly successful advocacy campaigns. Stones arranged in patterns near the station. Not the quartz memory stones, but river rocks, 3 in a line with 1 apart. Reminder and recognition. Sarah began wearing the memory stone openly, claiming it was a gift from a Native American elder during her Alaska research. Half-truth and strategic misdirection in service of deeper protection. She gave lectures on the ethics of wildlife documentation, arguing that some knowledge carried responsibility beyond publication. To witness, she told her graduate students, is to enter relationship, and relationship means prioritizing the subject's well-being over the observer's curiosity. Some understood, most didn't, but the ideas spread quietly through conservation biology circles, a new ethic emerging, unnamed but increasingly influential. 2 years after Tak's departure, Sarah returned to the Olympic station for a winter research stint. The second night she woke to sounds outside, low vocalizations, almost subsonic, felt in the chest more than heard. She dressed warmly and stepped onto the porch. The forest was dark, moon hidden behind cloud cover, but her eyes had adapted. At the tree line, perhaps 30 meters distant, a figure stood. Larger than any human, posture unmistakable. The figure raised one hand, held it there for a long moment, then turned and vanished into the trees with barely a sound. In the morning, she found another slate tablet near the porch steps. This one was different, not narrative, but ecological. Precise maps of the peninsula rendered in carved lines, salmon stream locations, elk migration routes, areas marked with symbols she'd come to recognize. Danger, human intrusion. Safety, protected by isolation or treaty. Sacred, ancestor sites. Untouchable. And at the center, a new symbol she hadn't seen before. The medical cabin, surrounded by a protective circle, with small figures standing within. Humans and forest people, impossible to distinguish without size markers. The message was clear. This place is protected. This place is shared. This place is border and bridge. Sarah photographed the tablet, encrypted the images, and stored them with the growing archive of evidence she would never publish. Then she did something she'd been preparing for 2 years. She laid out her own offering, a slate she'd carved herself, working from Tak's pictographic system. It showed the Olympic Peninsula, but extended the map beyond the wilderness to include the surrounding regions, areas marked for protection, color-coded by status, existing wilderness, green, proposed expansion, blue, threatened by development, red. And she'd added purchase opportunities, private land parcels that could be acquired by conservation groups, expanding the roadless territory. It was a strategic plan, rendered in the visual language of a people who had practiced landscape-scale thinking for millennia before humans invented the concept. She was offering them partnership, human, legal, and financial resources in service of their territorial needs, executed invisibly. The next night, the tablet was gone. In its place, 3 white quartz stones arranged in a triangle with the points toward her cabin. Acceptance. Over the following decade, Sarah became one of the nation's leading advocates for roadless area protection, testifying before Congress, consulting with the National Park Service, writing policy papers that shaped federal land management. She never explained the passion that drove her 16-hour days, the urgency that made wilderness conservation feel like life-or-death stakes. Because it was. In quiet moments, she calculated the mathematics of small populations, 40 individuals, declining slowly. Even with the additional protected territory, even with salmon populations rebounding, the genetic bottleneck was narrowing. They needed more range, more resources, more space, or they needed something else she couldn't give them. She was sitting in her university office, grappling with these grim actuarial facts, when Pete called. "You need to see something tonight. Bring Marco." They met at a trailhead she didn't recognize, 20 miles from the research station. Pete led them off-trail through old-growth forest, following a route that required climbing over nurse logs and wading through sword ferns that soaked them to the waist. After 2 hours of difficult hiking, he stopped at the base of a massive cedar. "Look up." Sarah craned her neck. Carved into the bark, 20 feet above ground, where weather and animals couldn't reach, was a pictograph sequence. She recognized the style immediately. Tax people, but more than one artist. Multiple hands working over time. The sequence told a story. Figures migrating, moving through landscapes. Then separation. One group going north, another northeast, a third southeast. Arrows indicating direction and distance. And at the endpoints of each arrow, the symbols for other territories. Glacier peaks, desert canyons, forested mountains. "They're not isolated," Marco breathed. "There are others. Other groups, other populations. They've been in contact all along. We just never saw it." "The night movements," Pete added. "Moving bodies at night isn't just about hiding from humans. It's about maintaining contact between groups. Genetic exchange. Information sharing. They've been operating as a meta-population this entire time." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but a recalibration of possibility. "How many groups?" Pete pointed to the pictograph clusters. "At least 7 marked here, maybe more. If each has 20 to 50 individuals, that's a viable population. Not thriving, but viable. They've engineered their own survival across the most remote wilderness areas in North America. And we never knew because we were looking for one population," Sarah said slowly. "One hidden group. But they're networked, moving information and genetic material through territories we thought were too far apart to allow communication. They're using the landscape the way neural networks use data flow," Marco added. "Distributed processing, redundancy, resilience through separation and connection." Sarah studied the pictograph migration routes, understanding, crystallizing. That's why they move at night, not just to avoid detection, to maintain the network. The young people traveling between groups, forming bonds, exchanging culture and genes. The dead being transported to central burial sites that serve as waypoints, places where multiple groups can leave messages. "The ancestor caves are communication nodes," Pete said. "That's brilliant and terrifying. We've had no idea we were sharing the continent with an intelligence operating at this level." They sat in silence as darkness gathered, watching the pictographs disappear into shadow. Somewhere in the Olympic wilderness, in the Cascades, the northern Rockies, the remote corners of the continent, humans thought they'd completely mapped. Other people moved through their ancient territories, not vanishing but persisting, not primitive but sophisticated, maintaining a civilization based on different values than agriculture, industry, or digital technology. A civilization of stewardship, invisibility, and deep time, operating successfully on the margins of human expansion for thousands of years. "We keep protecting habitat," Sarah said finally, "but we expand the scope. Network thinking. Protect the corridors between populations, not just the core territories. Every roadless area, every wilderness expansion isn't just about one group. It's about maintaining the connection that keeps the whole system viable." "That's a life's work," Marco observed. "Multiple lifetimes, maybe. There's no glory in it, no recognition, just decades of policy fights for land protection that most people won't understand or care about." "Good," Sarah replied, touching the quartz stone at her throat. "Glory would mean exposure. We're not trying to be heroes. We're trying to be worthy of the trust they showed when Tak let us treat him, when they shared their presence, when they offered partnership instead of retreat." Pete looked at the pictographs, now barely visible in twilight. You know what this means, don't you? This level of organization, this multi-generational planning, this ethical system that's kept them hidden and alive for millennia. It proves they're not evolutionary relics. They're not primitive survivors. They're a successful parallel development, another way of being human. Or beyond human, Marco added quietly. If success is measured by sustainable relationship with the environment, by cultural continuity, by the ability to coexist without domination, they're more advanced than we are. We're the ones on the edge of collapse, not them. The weight of this settled over them like the forest darkness, not heavy but total, undeniable. They'd stumbled into contact with another kind of intelligence, one that had watched humanity's rise with the patience of deep time, had survived by becoming legend, and had chosen, deliberately, consciously, a different path than expansion, agriculture, civilization as humans defined it. And that choice, that great refusal, deserved protection more than any discovery deserved revelation. "We go back," Sarah said. "We continue the work. We never publish, never claim, never seek credit. We just fight for roadless areas and wildlife corridors and habitat protection for all the official reasons. And we know privately what we're really doing. We're buying them time," Pete agreed. "Time for what, I don't know. Maybe just time to exist. Maybe that's enough." They hiked back in darkness, using headlamps only when necessary, learning to move more quietly through the forest than their training had taught them, unconsciously mimicking the methods of the people they'd sworn to protect. Sarah's last memory of that night was standing at her car, looking back at the forest that held so much more than trees and ferns and animals. Somewhere in that darkness, intelligence moved, culture persisted. Stories were told in pictograph and gesture, passed from generation to generation, maintaining the memory of a time before separation, before hiding, before the choice to become invisible. And three humans stood witness, bound by that knowledge, to lives of advocacy without explanation, passion without credit, devotion to protecting what they could never name. The covenant held. Years later, Sarah would train her own graduate students in the ethics of conservation biology, teaching them to question what revelation served when silence was more powerful than speech, how to love knowledge without needing to possess or display it. Some would understand, most wouldn't. But the ideas would spread, a new ethic emerging slowly, preparing the ground for a future when humanity might be ready for the truth they carried. Or preparing for a future where the truth would remain forever hidden, protected by guardians who chose honor over glory, relationship over recognition, and the survival of mystery over the satisfaction of solving it. Sarah touched the memory stone, worn smooth by decades of contact, and thought of Tuck, wherever he was, however he'd lived his life after that impossible night. The stone was promise and burden, gift and weight, reminder that to witness was to become responsible, and that responsibility could never be set down, only carried forward into whatever future humans and forest people might share, separate, connected, invisible, and somehow, against all odds, still alive. If this story moved you, captivated your imagination, or made you think differently about what might still be hidden in our world's wild places, please consider subscribing to the channel. Share this with someone who loves speculative fiction grounded in science, and leave a comment about what ethical choice you would make if faced with Sarah's dilemma. Your engagement helps stories like this reach others who crave thoughtful, realistic narratives that challenge our assumptions about intelligence, humanity, and our relationship with the unknown. Thank you for listening.